Hello and welcome to this video on multivitamins. Well, the question of if multivitamins have any appreciable benefit anyway. The multivitamin industry is worth more than $130 billion annually in the USA. This includes everything from vitamin C tablets to cocktails of various constitution. The claims for these supplements range from a general overall improvement to health, a better memory, to a panacea. The last of these are done by those with a very poor sense of moral and ethics. On the other hand, the same industry understates or does not even state the possible adverse effects of multivitamins. This owes to the nature of the supplement industry. It is, in the best of cases, poorly regulated, and in many cases not regulated at all. This brings us inevitably to what this industry does that makes it so profitable. That is the perception of health benefits. The key here is perception. You can perceive or think any number of things. This is why anecdotes aren't worth their salt. However, we need hard facts and data to be able to say that the claims made are actually true. Something supplements get away with because of bullshit rationale. This is where research into the benefits of multivitamins produces a mixed bag of results. Much of this is down to a very simple but critical flaw. That being that a multivitamin has no definition as such. There's a generally accepted definition, which is more a functional or working definition, rather than a set definition. What's generally accepted is that there's any combination of 3 or more vitamins with or without minerals. That's 3 out of dozens and dozens of different vitamins. As such, comparing a multivitamin to a multivitamin is incredibly difficult, especially when you then start considering if they're adding things like calcium, magnesium, and other minerals. Yeah, a lot of the research data is handicapped by this fundamental flaw, not just in the researcher's approach, but by the products themselves. This does bring us to at least some research that is, well, let's be blunt, you need to be taking it skeptically, but at least it is some sort of hard data. The first effectively hard point we can start with is the variability within multivitamins. As a rule, you can find that most of these have 10 to 20% more of the claimed content within them than what the label says. The reason for this is relatively straightforward. Most nutrients and vitamins that are used will degrade over time because of degradation, variability in manufacturing, and so on. Manufacturers add what is called a buffer amount to this, or an overage. This buffer amount is intended to adjust for the loss over time in storage, or for any variability within manufacturing. This is all well and good, except when you actually go to consume it, you don't know how much above the listed amount on the packaging you're actually getting. Remember, they're expecting it to be between 10 and 20% more than the label says, but we don't know how soon, how well stored, and so on, so you might be getting close to that 20% more than you expect. The further issue to this is that you're getting up to 120% of the expected amount. That's fine, most of the time, because of the second issue, and this is bioavailability. Bioavailability in terms of supplements isn't defined, or more accurately, there's no standardized definition. And this is a problem. Where you have bioavailability for medication and foods, these are all well established in very clearly set up experiments and trials. For food, it's slightly more complicated, but you get the same sort of idea. You just need to adjust for the fact that it's within a much more complex matrix of other materials. Nonetheless, for medication and for food, you can get a fair idea about the bioavailability. For multivitamins and the vitamins and nutrients within, there is no established bioavailability. This is a big problem. If, for example, you were able to consume a kilogram of broccoli, you might get a lot more of the necessary vitamins, minerals, and so on from that than you would if you were to consume a kilogram of multivitamins. Neither of these are suggestions, by the way. The reason for that is that bioavailability is the effectively dictating measure of how much of something you can actually absorb into your bloodstream from your GI tract. if the multivitamin doesn't have greater bioavailability, you don't absorb it, even if you eat it. This then leads us to the bioequivalence argument, and this is another problem, similar in ways to both the bioavailability issue and the lack of regulation for the supplements industry issue. Bioavailability is often conflated with bioequivalence, and the intention is to create a comparable measure. This would allow you to know if you consume X amount, for example that kilogram of broccoli, how many multivitamin pills or weight equivalent would you need to consume for the same benefit. To get those kinds of numbers, you need clinical trials. Clinical trials are expensive, and to be blunt, you don't want to be running them if you're trying to run a scam, because it would show that your scam is, well, just that. In terms of the industry, however, they don't do it because, well, expensive, but also what benefit are they trying to measure other than the absorption rate? Even if they were to conduct reasonably large-scale clinical trials of multivitamin absorption, you would then have to allow for inter-subject variability. That is, each person absorbs and will utilize different multivitamins very differently. It means you can't give one person the same multivitamin and expect their body to behave the same way as another individual. There are certainly ways in which you could try and standardize it and say this is the average, but that again requires that you actually run trials. There have been some double-blind placebo-controlled trials, admittedly one of them reasonably large for its purpose, and more importantly, rather long-running. It involved 14,000 male physicians or doctors. What we need to point out though is that these doctors all had a history of cancer, so that is a big problem with this study, but it is what it is. In terms of the results, they found that taking a multivitamin, there was an 8% reduction in total cancers, but there was no difference between males who had a history of cancer and those who didn't. So it appeared that there was just an 8% prevalence of cancer amongst participants, which didn't really help, showing that, yeah, even the best of studies don't really result in anything appreciable. There are other, let's say, aspects to this that were investigated. For example, cardiovascular disease, but again, there didn't seem to be any significant effect. Other studies tried to look at whether or not multivitamins would, let's say, lower your chance of dying. And, well, theoretically from this study, there was a higher incidence of death who those took multivitamins, which is probably not something they want to be using in their advertising. That result, however, is, to be quite blunt about it, flawed, because, well, many of the individuals involved already had a serious illness, so you give someone who's already sick a medication, it may not help them recover or get better. They'll still die. The other issue is that those involved may or may not have started using multivitamins after their health had already gone to the point where, no matter what you did, they were already stuffed. Then we have the cocoa supplement and multivitamin outcomes study, or the COSMOS study. This is another large study, but it also looked at older individuals. So again, it's got a very important skew to it. It was a very large, 21,000 individuals, so that alone is a arguably strength to this. But strength or not, it is still a problem, and it only ran for 3 years, which, given that multivitamins are meant to give you a long-term benefit as well as a short-term benefit, yeah, it's a problem. What they found was, well, exactly what we've already said, which is there's practically no real benefit. Of the two major studies we mentioned, arguably, the Physician Health Study 2 is the best, and it's the best for one simple reason. Where others have had a lot more variability and unknown effects, and to be nice about this, let's say confounding variables, the Physician Health Study 2 had a very, very schedulized set of multivitamins and minerals. This meant that they weren't just getting a random cocktail or whatever. They were getting the exact same thing that they were supposed to be getting, assuming they were in the experimental group. This meant that you could very clearly establish if the group in getting the multivitamin and the group that was your control, or the placebo group, you could clearly differentiate what was happening between them. Any and all of the gains within that study were, at the best, modest. And we mean really modest. But any negative effects, well, they tend to get swept under the rug, and this brings us to the next point. Now that we've spoken about the known benefits and the research that does indicate at least some kind of benefit, let's look at the demerits. First, we have the issue with fish oil. That's a rather fishy subject, but it's an important one. Most fish oil is going to be in a cocktail of ingredients. This cocktail of ingredients contains vitamin A. Vitamin A by itself is fine. It doesn't really do too much harm. It's good for your eyes, your heart, and a few other things. But if you have too much vitamin A, that's a problem. This is called hypervitaminosis A. If you are taking your fish oil supplement and you aren't accounting for the presence of that vitamin A, and you're taking a vitamin A supplement, and you're taking a multivitamin, you might now be triple dosing on the same thing. There's also a concern with it with regards to anticoagulation effects and bleeding, particularly if you're on warfarin. So, yeah, multivitamins are already dangerous just on that basis, but most of them aren't going to be a fatty acid like that. Most of them will be more fundamental. Perhaps more frequently used than the fish oil, although that's changing now. We have protein powders, and again, these are used in much the same way. They're used rather obviously to, well, build bodies, mostly for muscle mass. There are, however, some of these same proteins used in infant formulas to feed babies. The only major concern, for the most part, with this is one of two things. Either the high protein content within the dairy-type product that is used to create the formula will lead to ketosis, that is the breakdown of amino acids, into energy. Ketosis creates, or is used to create energy when the body doesn't have adequate access to glucose. The other issue has to do with its weak estrogenic effect. There are several related compounds within it that, if consumed in extremely high quantities, can have an effect, let's say, similar to estrogen. Vaguely similar, to be clear, but you also need to be consuming a lot of it, and it generally needs to be soy-based. Based on that, it is a very niche concern. Some supplements also use, or claim to have, anti-inflammatory and antioxidants present. These generally come in the form of catechols. Catechols generally derive from something like green tea, for instance, although there are other ways to get it. The problem with this is that, surprisingly, they do exactly the opposite, although that shouldn't be surprising once you understand the chemistry involved. Antioxidants bind to free radical oxygen species and neutralize them. That's because they have reactive groups on them. If you don't have antioxidants to react to radical oxygen species go wild. But if you don't have radical oxygen species and you introduce antioxidants, the antioxidants try and find something to react with. Yeah. Then we have the broader concerns. And this has to do with what we've already mentioned in passing, but whether or not you're overdosing on individual elements of your multivitamin. A multivitamin can be made up as few as 3 different compounds. It can be also made up of a great deal many more. For example, with that clinical trial of physicians, it was 31. Although that was 31 vitamins and minerals, so exact numbers aren't so great. Nonetheless, if you take a dedicated multivitamin, a supplement for a single vitamin, and arguably from your dietary intake, you now have 3 separate sources for one vitamin. And this means you can have a lot more entering your body than you initially think of. This is why there's a fairly large caveat and carve-out to what we've said so far, and it's a relatively small list of individuals who actually benefit from taking multivitamins, and they do so for a very good reason. First, we have the elderly, and the elderly benefit for a very simple reason in and of itself. they generally have poorer food intake, whether that is that they simply struggle to chew food, they don't enjoy the taste anymore, they have difficulty moving, they're depressed, and so on. Vitamin supplements for them can be beneficial, and particularly B vitamins. This allows them to not only absorb their food better, but also any nutrition within it. And if they're not getting nutrition from their diet, it makes up for that missing nutrition itself. Pregnant individuals, women, they particularly benefit from folate, B vitamin, and a few others. And this is, again, for well-known reasons. For example, a folate can significantly lower the risk of having a baby with spina bifida. Obviously, a good thing. Those females between the ages of 15 and 45 may also benefit from something like iron supplementation, for kind of obvious reasons. There's also calcium, vitamin D, and DHA, or effectively omega fatty acids. Then we have those who have, absorption problems. For example, if you have something like celiac disease or Crohn's, they can really cause trouble with the ability of the small intestine to absorb nutrients through it. By providing that extra supplementation, you can make up for the limited capacity to absorb food by providing a much slower release form of vitamins. Then there are surgeries that remove part of the GI tract or liver, and there are those who have, become alcoholics. Alcoholics generally damage their liver and intestines. Because of this, they have trouble absorbing things like vitamin B and vitamin C. And finally, we have some medications. Some medication can cause merry hell with your body's ability to not only absorb certain vitamins and minerals, but to retain them. And it's perhaps the retention that's the more important issue here than it is the absorption itself. For example, some blood pressure medication can drastically reduce the body's ability to reabsorb and hold on to things like magnesium, potassium, and calcium. Then there are others that would affect your B vitamin absorption, and so on. All of these need to at least somewhat be compensated for, whether that is through direct dietary means, effectively increasing your consumption of food rich in these things, or by taking something like a multivitamin. This is why multivitamins are largely useless for the average person. That's because there are some who would benefit, but they're likely to already be receiving appropriate medical care. For the rest of us, we're already receiving, for the most part, adequate dietary intake. If we're not, you can see a reason to take them, but for the most part, those who have a poor dietary intake of the things that a multivitamin contains are unlikely to be in a position to be buying multivitamins to make up for that inadequacy. They're more likely to try and, better their diet, as it would have other benefits as well, beyond just making up for a relatively minor deficiency overall. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.